Christianity has for many centuries maintained this idea of eternity, which is the idea of a God who exists outside of space and time. And what I'm saying is that this idea, which seemed a little bit crazy, very difficult to explain 100 years ago, now makes complete sense within modern physics. So my question to Dan Barker is this: if God didn't make the universe, who did? How did we get a universe? First there was nothing, and then there's a universe. If God doesn't explain it, why don't you do? Why don't you give us the explanation? Dan Barker cited Stephen Hawking in a rather convoluted quote that, far from undermining what I said, actually supported it. Stephen Hawking is the guy who did equations to show that, yes, the universe has a beginning. And then Stephen Hawking said, when I proved this, I became alarmed because I realized the theistic implications. In other words, nothing can come out of nothing. If there was nothing and then there was a universe, this seems to give support to the idea of a creator. So Hawking said, I'm very uncomfortable with that. I have to try now to figure out a way how this could have happened without God. And Hawking advances a theory which revolves on quantum fluctuations. Now, here's what Hawking says. He says maybe the universe came into existence in what he calls, quote, imaginary time. Is there such a thing as imaginary time? No. Where does the idea of imaginary time exist? Pretty much in Stephen Hawking's imagination. If you ask Stephen Hawking, do you have one shred of empirical evidence for your theory? He says, I have to confess, I don't. I've essentially made it up to get around the idea of God. And Hawking admits, my fellow physicists don't agree with me. They kind of laugh this as ridiculous. But Hawking says, but that's my theory. All right. But we are relying here on Stephen Hawking's reputation as a scientist, not on his atheist imagination. Now, I've spoken for a moment about the universe having a beginning. I think that points to a creator. Let me give you a second argument, which is sometimes called the fine-tuning argument. And the idea here is that our universe operates according to some very specific numerical values. If I take this pen and drop it, it will accelerate to the ground at a known speed. That's the speed of gravity. That's the force of gravity, pulling the pen, if you will, to the ground. If a light beam flashes by us, it travels at a known speed. In science, that's called c, 186,000 miles a second in a vacuum. So the universe has multiple values. The electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, something called the weak force. And one physicist, Lee Smolin, who teaches at Princeton, he says it's sort of like this. It's like God is sitting at a big desk, and he's got 100 different dials, each representing one numerical constant, very precisely set to a fixed number. And then Lee Smolin says, but what if we scientists sneak into the room, and when God isn't looking, we fool with the dials? We change it. What if light were not to travel at 186,000 miles a second? What if it was 200,000 miles a second? What if the values of the universe were a little different? And then, this question, by the way, is studied by Stephen Hawking, and he describes it in his book, A Brief History of Time. He says basically that if you come in and you touch one of the dials, in this case, the rate of expansion of the universe, and you move it, he says, not 10%, not 1%, but 1 part in 100,000th millionth million, you would have no universe, you would have no life.